The summons came without warning, an email marked mandatory. No subject line, just a location on the 22nd floor. I walked into the glass-walled conference room overlooking Midtown Manhattan and knew instantly what it was. The table was bare except for a single paper cup, the kind of cheap catering brew I always drank. Not even water, not even a pen laid out as courtesy. Ethan Carrick, the new CFO, stood waiting in a navy suit that looked more expensive than it fit. He didn't sit, didn't even offer a chair. A junior HR rep perched nervously at the far end, scrolling her phone as if she wished she could vanish. "We're restructuring," Ethan said, flipping through a folder that looked rehearsed. "Your position has been deemed redundant, effective immediately. You're no longer with Langward." The words were mechanical, almost lazy. 14 years distilled to one sentence. I kept my hands folded in my lap, refusing to give him the tremor he wanted to see. "And one more thing," he added, scrawling across the termination letter like a teacher signing a tardy slip. "You're not to contact anyone internally or externally. We'll handle transitions." He slid the page toward me with a smile meant to be final. But the movement shifted another binder across the table, a thick contract portfolio with my name highlighted in yellow. My eyes caught it in the briefest glance: Corinne Hale, designated liaison, date signed 3 weeks ago. The ink was barely dry. They had just ratified my name into a multi-million-dollar agreement. And now, with a casual flick of his pen, they were erasing me as if the contract didn't exist. I slipped my father's leather-bound notebook from my bag, placed it in front of me, and signed the termination letter with a calm hand. I didn't argue, didn't beg. Years in procurement had taught me one truth: the most dangerous clause is the one the arrogant forget to read. I rose, leaving the untouched coffee behind. Ethan nodded as if he'd won something. HR gathered the papers quickly, trying not to meet my eyes. I walked out into the hallway carrying only my bag and the quiet certainty that their victory had already cost them more than they understood. I started at Langward in my 20s, fresh out of grad school, clutching a laptop that overheated if you so much as opened Excel too long. Back then, I believed effort could build security. Nights turned into mornings in airport lounges, flying coach to obscure suppliers, bargaining through interpreters just to secure parts that kept our systems alive. I missed Christmas dinners, postponed birthdays, learned to live out of a suitcase that never fully unpacked. Over time, I built the vendor network into something that actually worked, a machine of relationships and trust. Every renegotiated clause, every spreadsheet combed for errors, every late-night call from Shenzhen or Hamburg saved the company money they never admitted to, but always banked. And then, in one meeting, it was gone. When I returned to my floor, my nameplate was already gone from my desk, pulled as neatly as if it had never been screwed in. My Slack channels had vanished, login disabled. To the system, I was a ghost erased at the source code. I walked past my colleagues, people who had leaned on me during crises, who once stayed in the office until 3 a.m., with me eating vending machine pretzels to finish vendor reviews. They couldn't meet my eyes now. Some looked away. Others stared at their monitors with unnatural focus, pretending not to notice. At Langward, proximity to the erased was dangerous. Humiliation washed over me, 14 years deleted faster than a bad email. But beneath that sting was a colder awareness. I remembered the contract binder on the conference table, my name glowing in yellow ink like a beacon. Ethan had signed off on those pages. He had seen my name, approved it, stamped it into existence less than a month ago. And then he tried to erase me with a single stroke of his pen. I picked up the last box from my desk, holding it steady even as my chest burned. If they wanted me gone, they had just forgotten one thing: paper remembers what people forget. The memory came back sharp. like a splinter I'd carried too long. It was 2018, and we'd lost an entire quarter's revenue because a liaison in procurement had been shuffled out overnight. No notice, no handoff, just a disappearance that left our biggest supplier confused and our orders stranded in limbo. The fallout was brutal, millions lost, relationships fractured, our credibility shredded. I sat through endless postmortems, every executive pointing fingers, but no one willing to admit the obvious, you don't gut institutional memory without bleeding for it. That was the day I swore it wouldn't happen again. So I buried a safeguard in the next renewal with our most critical supplier. Buried, but in plain sight. I drafted what I called a vendor continuity clause if Corinne Hale, named explicitly, was removed as liaison without 30 days' notice. The supplier had the contractual right to invoice the full remaining value of the agreement. No debate. No arbitration, just one clean settlement bill. I argued it was protection for both sides. The supplier wanted stability. We wanted assurance. Legal nodded. The CFO at the time signed, and the clause became law between us. Twice since then, it had rolled over in renewals, reviewed by teams who never bothered to dig past the boilerplate. Each time, my name was typed in, size 10, Calibri. Like a faint watermark, no one noticed. The last signature on the most recent renewal belonged to Ethan Carrick. His initials slashed across the margin, a sign-off probably given while he skimmed through with half his mind on a networking call. He had reauthorized my name into the contract himself, and this morning, with a smile that barely reached his eyes, he had written the order that erased me. Now the two sat together like loaded dice, his ink on my claws, his instruction as the trigger. I slid the last file from my desk into the cardboard box, the weight suddenly lighter than I expected. Paper remembers, even when people don't. And this paper was still very much alive. I packed my desk the way I'd once cleaned my garage after the divorce, slow, deliberate, pretending every object was neutral. HR lingered a few feet away, waiting for the tears that never came. They wanted a scene to justify their notes, something messy they could file under emotional response. I gave them nothing. The branded water bottles, the stress toys from corporate retreats, the faded company t-shirt with the logo peeling off, I left them all. Let the next poor soul inherit them. What I kept fit into one small box, my father's leather-bound notebook. The cactus Monica from legal had given me 3 Christmases ago, and a pen that had survived more contract negotiations than most executives could stomach. As I walked the hallway, colleagues glanced up and quickly down again. 14 years collapsed into awkward silence. By the time I reached the lobby, even the security guard who used to chat about Knicks scores wouldn't meet my eyes. I pressed my badge to the scanner one last time. A hollow beep echoed back. Red light flashing. Access denied. My employment was officially erased from the system. But in that denial, another system across town woke up. The vendor portal registered a change liaison removed. A line of code shifted status from green to red. To Ethan and his HR shadow, it was nothing more than an exit beep. To the supplier's compliance server, it was a breach of continuity, an unacknowledged removal of the named contact. I balanced the cactus carefully in the box and pushed through the revolving door into the August heat. Behind me, glass towers reflected a company convinced it had scrubbed me from its bloodstream. What they didn't see was the fuse already burning in silence, a protocol written in legal ink and automated code, counting down without mercy. 3 hours after I walked out, an email landed in finance with the kind of politeness only a machine can manage. Subject line: Final Settlement Invoice. Attached a tidy PDF for $250,000 stamped and signed, payment due within 30 days. No discounts, no negotiations, just cold contractual math. At the same time, the supplier's portal locked itself down. Purchase orders sat in limbo. Approvals grayed out. Shipments halted. The system didn't care about office politics or Ethan Carrick's ambition. It only cared about compliance. And compliance had just flagged the absence of Corinne Hale, designated liaison. Ethan was blindsided. I imagined him staring at the invoice in his corner office. Necktie tugged loose. Flipping through the contract he barely remembered signing. There, at the bottom of page 17, his own initials. He had stamped the very clause now detonating under his feet. Budgets froze overnight. Department heads were told to pause discretionary spending. Marketing pulled back on campaigns mid-flight. Operations bristled at halted shipments. Project managers scrambled for explanations. Slack threads went dark as people whispered in hallways instead. Everyone sensed something was wrong, though no one could name it yet. I didn't need to lift a finger. The dominoes had been lined up years ago, and Ethan had given them the push. Each hour that passed, the silence inside the company grew heavier, more brittle, like glass ready to shatter. Somewhere, I pictured Ethan drafting emails he wouldn't dare send, searching for ways to bury the invoice, to buy time. But there was no workaround. The system had already spoken, and my name typed in small, neat calibri was the key it refused to turn without. And above him, on the top floor, the CEO would soon notice the sudden freeze creeping through every budget line. By the next morning, the first text lit up my phone. Morgan, who had once shared an endless string of caffeine-fueled nights across from me in vendor ops, didn't bother with pleasantries. He's unraveling. Budgets frozen. Vendors furious. A second ping followed minutes later. This time from Eric, one of the junior analysts I'd trained 2 years ago. They're blaming me for not updating the contact field. I swear, Corinne, I didn't even have clearance. I think they're trying to hang this on me. I held the phone in my hand, thumb hovering over the keyboard, the urge to reply almost painful, but Ethan's words echoed back. Do not contact anyone internally or externally. The line he'd thought would silence me now shackled him instead. I obeyed it to the letter, letting silence become the sharpest blade. And the silence spread. Departments whispered of projects stalled midstream. Vendors called customer service lines in confusion, demanding answers no one could give. Rumors trickled down the halls about a contractual issue so severe even legal had gone bunker mode. Morgan sent another message. Travel budget slashed overnight. He hasn't left his office in 2 days. Door shut. Lights off. I pictured Ethan pacing in that corner office, sweat on his collar, staring at a 6-figure invoice he couldn't unsign, watching colleagues scurry past like they might catch his failure by proximity. I didn't type a word back. Not to Morgan, not to Eric, not to anyone. My silence honored his order, but it also tightened the noose he had tied with his own pen. Every hour I said nothing. The weight of unanswered questions grew heavier on his shoulders. The whispers were no longer confined to private texts or hushed conversations by the elevators. They were building into a hum that would soon breach the walls of the executive boardroom, demanding explanations no jargon could cover. By Thursday morning, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Every executive with a budget over $5,000 was summoned to the top floor. No agenda, just a subject line. Emergency assembly, mandatory attendance. The boardroom at headquarters looked like a courtroom masquerading as a glass fishbowl. Long mahogany table, city skyline bleeding through floor-to-ceiling windows, and a silence sharp enough to cut skin. At the head sat the CEO, expression unreadable, hands folded with the calm of a judge waiting to pronounce sentence. Ethan walked in late, carrying a neat leather folder, his usual swagger dampened by the sweat already gathering at his collar. He cleared his throat, tried to summon authority. We're addressing what appears to be a legacy clause issue, an ambiguity in one of the older vendor contracts. Standard language, not a material risk. But unfortunately, it triggered an invoice. He tapped the folder as if the weight of paper could soften the number inside. A ripple of irritation ran down the table. Executives who had spent their careers parsing fine print weren't moved by words like ambiguity. That's when Darren, the company's senior legal counsel, spoke. He rarely raised his voice above a murmur, but the sound of him clearing his throat froze the room. Beige polo, wire-rim glasses, eyes sharp as a scalpel. Clause 14P6A is explicit, he said evenly. The designated liaison, Corinne Hale, was removed without 30 days' notice. That action automatically triggered the settlement. There is no ambiguity. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the HVAC hum seemed to pause. Directors glanced from the printed invoice in front of them to Ethan, then back to Darren, as if waiting for a contradiction that never came. Ethan's jaw flexed, his hand tightening around the folder like it might anchor him to authority. But his initials sat right there, stamped on the last renewal. Every eye in the room could see it. The invoice wasn't a glitch, and the freeze-strangling budgets wasn't an accident. It was his own pen come back to haunt him. The CEO broke the silence with 4 words, calm but weighted. Who approved this clause? Ethan straightened in his chair, the leather folder clutched like a shield. It was inherited language. He began, his tone slipping into the kind of corporate patter that might have worked in a quarterly briefing, not material risk. Standard vendor terms we didn't anticipate would ever be activated. The directors exchanged glances, unimpressed. They had built empires on commas in contracts, survived audits that could cripple companies. Standard language was code for negligence, and everyone in the room knew it. The CEO leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes locked on Ethan, who signed off. Ethan's voice cracked. It predates my tenure. It who signed off. The words cut like glass, trembling. Ethan opened the folder and slid out a single page. Not the contract. My termination letter. The paper landed in front of the CEO with a dull slap. About halfway down, in bold ink, the sentence I'd watched him write by hand: employee is not to contact anyone internally or externally. The board's collective gaze fell on the line. It wasn't just arrogance, it was the tripwire. By forbidding me to reach out. Ethan had ensured there was no notice to the supplier, no transition, no handoff, no cover. He had written the exact words that activated Clause 14.6a. One of the directors muttered, "You pulled the pin yourself." Another leaned back, arms folded, watching Ethan shrink in his chair. The CEO read the letter twice, eyes narrowing but voice still quiet. When he finally looked up, the room felt colder. The evidence sat on the table, undeniable, and everyone knew what it meant. The clause hadn't just been triggered by chance. It had been triggered by Ethan's own hand. The silence deepened, stretching like a taut wire. Ethan's collar darkened with sweat, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words arriving. The room didn't need them. The judgment was already forming in the air, waiting to be spoken aloud. The board's whispers started low, like static under the hum of the air vents. "Rookie move," one director muttered, erasing institutional memory. Another added, her tone sharp with disdain. Ethan tugged at his collar, sweat soaking the starched cotton. He tried to muster a defense, but his voice cracked, betraying the panic in his throat. This was an oversight, a procedural misalignment. Legacy terms. The CEO raised a hand and the room fell still. His gaze didn't shift from Ethan. You signed the renewal. You gave the order. You issued the instruction that triggered the clause. Ethan, This is yours alone. The words landed with the weight of a gavel. There was no shield left for him to hide behind, no jargon thick enough to muffle the truth. Then HR, almost apologetic, spoke up from the corner. For the record, we weren't even notified formally. We only processed the deactivation after the termination letter was filed. We didn't know she was gone until the badge request came through. The board digested that in silence. A ghost firing, no transition plan, no coverage, no acknowledgement. Just a quiet deletion of 14 years, treated as if it were clerical work. The CEO leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, eyes heavy with disappointment. So firing her not only cost us $250,000 in penalties, he said slowly, it froze our vendor pipelines and exposed the company to breach, all because you believed you could erase experience without consequence. Ethan tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his throat. His hands trembled on the folder like a child clutching homework no one wanted to read. Around him, directors sat in rigid silence, watching his mask of competence crumble piece by piece. The sentence had been delivered without needing to be spoken outright. His authority had evaporated, his credibility stripped bare. By the time the meeting adjourned, everyone in the room knew the same truth. Ethan Carrick's career at Langward was already over. And while his world collapsed in that Manhattan tower, I was across the river in Brooklyn, pouring myself another cup of coffee. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table in Brooklyn, hoodie zipped to my chin, steam curling up from a chipped mug of coffee. Jeopardy played softly in the background, the kind of routine noise that filled the quiet when life had emptied itself out. For the first time in years, I wasn't calculating margins or redlining contracts. I was just a woman at her table, breathing without deadlines. The first ping came just after dusk, an email from the vendor compliance officer, subject line simple clause execution. The body was even simpler. Thank you for drafting a safeguard that protected both sides. It did exactly what it was meant to do. I read it twice, then set my phone down. It wasn't praise, not exactly, but acknowledgement that the work I had buried in fine print had mattered, had done more than survive. It had shielded the system from chaos. Hours later, another message slid into my inbox. No name, no signature. Just plain text. We underestimated you. The company won't forget this. I stared at the words. The echo of powerlessness I'd felt in that glass conference room suddenly rewritten. They had tried to erase me, to prove I was disposable. Instead, they had inscribed my name deeper into the company's memory than any farewell email could. I glanced at the notebook on the table. Leather worn smooth from years of my father's hands before mine. I flipped it open to a page I'd once scribbled in the margins after a sleepless night at headquarters. The fine print remembers what people forget. It had been a private mantra back then, a reminder to be thorough when no one else cared. Now it was proof that preparation outlives arrogance, and foresight outlives bluster. Ethan had erased me to prove power. But real power was this building something they couldn't erase, something that would outlast titles, offices, and the men who thought they were untouchable. I closed the notebook, slid it back into my bag, and let the hum of the city outside fill the silence. My name had been deleted from their system, but in the contracts still binding their future, I was more present than ever.